ask your question aloud or have somebody translate.
What emotions did you go through during the war? What emotions did you go through during the war?
What emotions did you go through during the war?
I went from patriotic emotions of feeling deep anger at the attack of Pearl Harbor, a hatred against the Japanese. I felt vividly alive when I watched the bombing of Japan, and vividly alive when I shot down Japanese airplanes, and terrible, terrible depression when I thought about people dying, my friends dying. So I went through the entire gamut of emotions, from fear, happiness, depression. That's what I went through. Good question. Anybody else?
Right here.
Yes, your question.
All right. What was your first time flying, Mike?
My first flying?
Yeah.
That was the day that my first flying was in a Stearman in February of 1943. My first day of alone flying, solo, was February 22nd, 1943. I was 1 week into my 19th year.
Over here. Who's that?
What did you eat?
What did you eat?
Lousy food. when we landed on Iwo Jima, we had K rations. These were packaged rations. They had Spam and beans and terrible food. The best food was on the carrier, the aircraft carrier. We ate at the captain's table. We had turkey and steak and hams and lamb chops every night for 11 days. But after that, it was all downhill. We had unidentified juice. We had cereal with or without lumps. We had terrible, terrible food in the military. But we survived. We weren't in it for it. It was not like we were in a restaurant. Whatever they gave us, that's what we ate. It was sustenance. You understand the word sustenance? Kept us alive. That's it. Good question. Anybody else?
Right here, stand up. Use the microphone.
How long did you rest between missions?
Say that. Somebody translate.
How long did you rest between missions?
We flew a long-range mission every day. Every mission was a long-range mission over Japan. Then we had a day of rest. And then we flew a local mission. And then we flew a long range. So every 3 or 4 days, we made a trip over Japan. And we only flew escort missions for 12 missions, 12 bombing missions, because they changed from daylight bombing to night bombing, and the fighters could not do anything flying at night. The B-29s only went up at night.
Is it true that some people had to take certain drugs in order to stay awake days at a time?
I can't understand.
Did people have to take drugs to stay awake over days for missions?
Come on.
Did people have to take drugs or something to keep them awake for the long missions?
You know, on the very first mission, we were debriefed by our flight surgeon. And the letdown, the high of going into combat and wondering if you would be able to function in combat kept you up high, kept the adrenaline. When you started to come back, you got very let down. I mean, there was just a gigantic letdown. And you could see the propellers stop spinning on some of the younger pilots. So we told that to the flight surgeon. And so he gave us, on the second or third mission, he gave us a Benzedrine, which is an upper. And we took it an hour before we hit the target so that we kept the energy, kept flowing until we got back to Iwo Jima, and then it would wear off. Yes, I took a Benzedrine every mission that I flew after the first or second mission.
How old are you after the war?
How?
How old after the war? How old were you when the war ended?
I was 21 years old when the war ended. I was 2 months shy of my 22nd birthday when I was discharged. You have a question up there?
Could you tell us a little bit about the books you've written?
I have never ever spoken to a soldier, a sailor, a marine, an airman who was in combat, who was willing to talk about what he saw or what he did. Pure purpose of life is to connect with people. That's the pure purpose of life, for me. The pure purpose of war is to kill people. And when you get out of the military, there's no training for de-killing. Everybody suffers from what they did as a soldier. If they did the same thing as a civilian, they'd be electrified or they'd be killed or they'd be put in jail. Same thing, no different. So I never really spoke about war to my children. They knew three things. They knew that I was a fighter pilot. They knew that I bailed out of a P-40 and spent 9 hours in the ocean. And they knew that I flew over Japan. No detail, nothing. In 1988, when I went to the wedding, I came back. This is 43 years later. And I felt that I had to tell my children my story. So I started to write. I just visualized everything that I did and everything that I had seen up until that point in time. I wrote a book called Of War and Weddings. Of War and Weddings. And then in 1995, there was a 50th anniversary of a B-29 raid that killed 100,000 citizens of Tokyo and destroyed 1 million homes, made millions of people homeless on March 10, 1945. On March 10, 1995, I was invited by Japanese public television to be part of a ceremony in Japan, and I went there. Robert was living there. And I was in his house talking to him in front of a television camera. On June 20th, 1945, two B-29s crashed together over Shizuoka, Japan, and 23 Americans were killed, 11 crewmen and 1 man who was training to be a command pilot on the next mission. 23 Americans were killed. And the crash fell, the remains of the airplane fell on a farm owned by a man by the name of Fukamatsu Ito, who took the remains that he found and put them in a common box and buried them, for which he was put in jail. But he also found a canteen with the blackened canteen, an American canteen, with the handprint of the man who was incinerated in the fire and the explosion. When he got out of jail, he erected a monument on top of Mount Shizahate in Shizuoka, Japan. It says, the monument in Japanese says B-29, and it tells that story. And the man by the name of Hirayo Sugano was given that canteen, and every Saturday since 1948, that canteen has been used in a ceremony honoring the 23 Americans who were killed. So when Robert was talking to me on Japanese public television, Dr. Sugano saw that and asked Robert to come June 20th, 1995, to the ceremony and be a translator. And he went to that ceremony. I went in 2000, in 1996, and I saw that ceremony. And when I came home, I had to write a book about it. So I did some research, and I wrote a book called The Blackened Canteen. Those are 2 books I wrote. Then I wrote a book about my dreams of what I would like to see with more people than I see today, called The Letter. And it's just a pure fiction story of events in my life, that some happened, some didn't happen, about a very powerful senator who was conceived on Iwo Jima between a Jewish father and a Catholic woman, who was given up for adoption to somebody who said, I will adopt it if all the papers about adoption are destroyed and he becomes my wife's son and my son, and nobody ever knows that he's adopted. And that man grows up to be a very powerful senator in America who wants to make Christianity the only religion in America. And he hates Catholics and he hates Jews. And a letter is written by his mother when she's dying, telling the story, because he hated everything that he was, himself, Catholic and Jewish, half and half. So that's, I would like people not to believe, not to be what they believe, but to be what they are, human beings, all of us, human beings. We are not what we believe. We are all connected as human beings, not what we believe. So I wrote a book called The Letter. And then I was asked to write a book about 9/11 guys, the Afghan war and the Iraqi war, 23 cumulative years, where 3 million of us served, 3 million people served, and the post-traumatic stress. So I wrote a book called The Resilient Warrior, which includes transcendental meditation for post-traumatic stress disorder. Those are 4 books I wrote. I wrote another book that's called Legacy, What We Left Behind, What We Leave Behind. Because what we leave behind is very important. Our legacy is very important. When I was 13 years old, within the Jewish religion, you learn Hebrew, and you become bar mitzvah, which means that you could stand on a pulpit and open up the Torah and be part of the holy ceremony. While I was reading that, while I was studying Hebrew when I was 13 years old, 1937, I was reading a book by a minister by the name of Lord Douglas called The Magnificent Obsession, reading that book at the same time. The Magnificent Obsession is about a town in the Adirondack Mountains where there's a very, very wealthy son of the richest people in the area who's drowning, and an elderly doctor in his 70s is having a heart attack, and the fire department has one resuscitator, and they have to choose who's they're going to use the resuscitator. They choose the young man, and the doctor dies. And thousands upon thousands of people come to the doctor's funeral, unbeknownst to his family. They were shocked, and they discovered that he had a journal. And in the journal, the first lines of his journal was this: do something good for someone every day of your life, and don't tell anybody about it, because if you tell somebody about it, you'll use up the good that you did for them and for any benefit that you might get yourself. So everybody that came to his funeral were the beneficiaries of what Dr. Hudson had done through his entire life. And that made a big, big, big impression on me. Any other questions? Let's do the museum. Thanks again.